Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night reading of the book of Mark. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5 tonight. We're going to be splitting it up, though. We're only going to be doing half the chapter. We're going to be referencing the other half, but I encourage you to, of course, to read the full chapter on your own. It's a wonderful chapter. It goes kind of flows with the last story we read in chapter 4 last week, and the first story we're going to read next week in chapter 6. Unfortunately, with the Gospel of Mark, the chapters get very long from here on in, and it's very difficult to do a complete reading of each chapter each week, but we're looking forward to going through and hearing what the preacher or the gospel writer Mark has to say to us when he talks to us about the good news, or the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so as we've been doing, we're going to play some songs. I think these are more familiar songs with us, a little bit older version, but please, hopefully you'll sing along with them or you'll enjoy them.
The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by. My soul he doth restore again, and me to walk doth make. Within the paths of righteousness, within the paths of righteousness, for his own name's sake. Yea, though I walk in death's dark vale, yet will I fear not ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod, for thou art with me, and thy rod, and staff me comforts. My table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes. My head thou dost with oil anoint. My head thou dost with oil anoint, and my cup overflows. Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me, and in God's house forevermore, and in God's house forevermore, my dwelling place shall be. There are 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold, but one was out on the hills away far off from the gates of gold. Away on the mountains wild and bare, away from the tender shepherd's care, away from the tender shepherd's care. Lord, thou hast here thy 99, are they not enough for thee? But the shepherd made answer, this of mine has wandered away from me. And although the path be rough and steep, I go to the desert to find my sheep. I go to the desert to find my sheep. But none of the ransomed ever knew how deep were the waters crossed, nor how dark was the night that the Lord passed through, where he found his sheep that was lost. For out in the desert he heard its cry, was sick and helpless and ready to die, was sick and helpless and ready to die. Lord, whence are those blood drops all the way that marks at the mountain's track? They're shed for one who had gone astray, and the shepherd could bring him back. Lord, whence are thy hands so red and torn? They're pierced tonight by many a thorn. They're pierced tonight by many a thorn. But all through the mountains thundering, and up from the rocky steep, there rose a glad cry to the gate of heaven, rejoice, I have found my sheep. And the angels echo round the throne, rejoice, for the Lord brings back his own. Rejoice, for the Lord brings back his own. Oh, thou blessed rock of ages, I am trusting now, dear Lord, in thee. I'm trusting. Keep me till thy journey's ended. Keep me till thy blessed face I see. Hide me, O blessed rock of ages. Hide me till thy blessed face I see. In glory. When the storm around me rages, blessed rock of ages, hide thou me. Keep me when the storm clouds gather, keep me till the sun comes shining through the shadows. Keep me till thy work is over, keep me till I bid this world adieu. Hide me, O blessed rock of ages, hide me till thy blessed face I see in glory. When the storm around me rages, blessed rock of ages, hide thou me. When my journey is completed, Savior, and there's no more work to do, O blessed Savior, guide my weary spirit to that happy land beyond the blue. Hide me, O blessed rock of ages, hide me till thy blessed face I see in glory. When the storm around me rages, blessed rock of ages, hide thou me.
So we're in Mark chapter 5 again, as I said at the outset. I want us to go back, though, just for a moment to Mark chapter 1. And if you remember kind of last week, Jesus told the parable of the sower and the seed, and then the other little parables of the tiny seeds and how they grow. And that plays a part in the rest of the Gospel of Mark, of course, plays a part in the ministry of Jesus, the purpose of Jesus. And then we ended last week, remember, with that magnificent event where Jesus is comfortable enough to be asleep while this wild storm comes across the sea. The disciples are very concerned. They wake him up. Do you not care that we're perishing? Jesus, of course, stands up, rebukes the storm, and he commands it to stop, to be silent, and everything is okay. Everything is safe. But then he turns to the disciples and he issues them a challenge. Why do you not yet have faith? Why are you so afraid? And so we mentioned last week that Mark has a purpose, or a twofold purpose when he's writing. One is the identity of Jesus. And then, of course, it is the proper or faithful response that we are to make to Jesus. The sower sows the seed, remember, and there's a lot of seed that's going to go to waste because the soil is not prepared to receive it. But there is going to be good seed, and there's going to be good crop, and there's going to be success as far as Jesus' kingdom is concerned. And then he tells the two parables of the small seeds, right? The farmer doesn't know how it grows, but sleeps and rises, and it grows. And then the little seed is going to grow into this massive plant, this massive tree, and there's going to be success. There is going to be success. And the disciples have to have this trust in Jesus. And we are being called, when we listen to the gospel, that we are being called to, that we need to have this trust in Jesus as well. And so the identity of Jesus and our faithful response to Jesus are the two main concerns of Mark's gospel, Mark's writing. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Who is this, the disciples asked? Well, Mark has already told us who he is. He is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who is the bringer of good news. And it's not just the good news from Jesus, it's the good news about Jesus, right? And that's kind of what we spoke about back in chapter 1. But in chapter 1, in verse 7, John the Baptist is being questioned about who he is and what his identity is. And then John the Baptist mentions something, and he says in verse 7, "After me comes he who is mightier than I." Now, John could have used a lot of words there. Someone who is coming who's better than me. Someone is coming who's more righteous than me. Someone is coming who's more glorious than me. But John uses a specific word here. Someone is coming. He is coming who is mightier than I. That he's someone who has power. And part of our faithful response is trusting in that power. He is so powerful that he can go to sleep during life-threatening storms. That's how powerful he is, that he's comfortable enough in going to sleep. And so just kind of remember that as we read through the gospel, because that's kind of in chapter 1, right? So it's going to have a part of the rest of the story. You know, oftentimes when we want to kind of know where the book of the New Testament is going, we look at the introduction, don't we? And that's going to tell us a lot about the purpose of the writer, the purpose that the writer is writing this book for us. And the Gospels are no different. So he is mightier than I, John says. This is the characteristic, this is the trait or quality that John focuses on. He who is mightier than I. I'm not worried that unloose a strap or whatever it might be. So we get to Mark chapter 5, and we're not going to read the first 20 verses. Great story. It's a great event. But I think one of the things we want to just mention here is that when we read the Gospels, and so that includes the Gospel of Mark, we are not simply reading a writing that is descriptive, where it just describes what Jesus did. There is description there, don't get me wrong, but it isn't just descriptive. It's also prescriptive, that there's teaching there. There's instruction. And it may not be as familiar instruction as, say, direct commands, right? Like don't lie to one another, or make sure you don't steal, but work with your own hands so you have something to give to those who are in need, and so on. But there's still prescription there. And so all these events that we find Jesus intermingling with the disciples, intermingling with the crowds, doing things that no other human could ever do, there's something there besides just describing what he did 2,000 years ago. And somehow we can say, okay, yeah, he proved way back then that he was the Messiah. Well, he did, but that also means he's still the Messiah. There's something here. And so verses 1 through 20, you've got this story where Jesus comes face to face with this demon-possessed man. Now, Jesus has met demon-possessed people already in the Gospel of Mark, and they have this kind of ability to identify who Jesus is, right? What have you to do with us, Son of God? or other descriptions like that. They have an ability to recognize who Jesus is. Jesus directs them, commands them, forces them to do something. There's not really a battle. There's not really tension because Jesus is just able to cast them out with his power. He is mightier than John, right, with his power. And then he gives this like cryptic statement that he wants the demons to be quiet. Don't tell anybody, right? Well, he comes into the country of the Gerasenes, and this is following what just took place with the disciples on the boat. Jesus enters into Gentile territory. And one of the things we understand when we read the Gospels is that Jesus is fighting the real enemy. Now, the Jews had this great hope that their Messiah would come and fight their enemy. Like David fought Goliath, their Messiah would come and fight the enemy. And all four Gospels and the Apostle Paul agree, he did fight the enemy, but he shows us who the real enemy is. The real enemy were not the Romans. The real enemy is not the Gentile nations. The real enemy is Satan. And Jesus comes into combat with Satan and his forces. Now, what we know about this demon-possessed man is he is about as unclean as a person can be. When you look at verses 2 and verse 3, we're not going to read it all, but he's about as unclean as you could be. There's an unclean spirit in him, and he's living among the tombs, right? Dead bodies and everything. So this guy's about as unclean as he can be. He cannot really be controlled. The townspeople are trying to constrain him, but he's really uncontrollable. He comes face to face with Jesus. The demon, of course, recognizes Jesus, right? And Jesus kind of, again, there's no tension here. Jesus just says, you're going to come out of this guy. They make a deal with Jesus. Please put us into those pigs. Jesus puts them in the pigs, and the pigs rush into the water and kill themselves, right? And you look at verse 13, numbered about 2,000. This was a massive display. And this makes people want to come and see what's going on, right? And you'll notice, we'll read verses 15 through 17. Everybody wants to see what's going on. They came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Now, they're afraid of the demon-possessed man earlier on. That's why they put him in chains and try to constrain him into the tombs. But now that they see the miracle that Jesus has done, they're afraid again. They're afraid when they see the demon-possessed man clothed and in his right mind. Well, verse 16, and those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And so people had seen it, and they said to these people who are frightened by it, it was Jesus. He's the one who did this, and he's able to direct them any way that he wants them to go, and things just happen. And so it says in verse 17, they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. They actually reject Jesus. They reject Jesus. They beg Jesus to leave. This power that he has frightens them, and they beg Jesus to leave. And what's interesting here is they try to contain evil with chains and putting him in a different area and everything, but they actually reject the one who's more powerful than evil. They actually reject the one that John said is mightier than I, the one who is more powerful than evil. They actually reject him. It's just ironic that they do this. They try to contain evil, but they reject the one who can defeat evil. Well, we know that this is the first person who's actually commissioned by Jesus. He actually faithfully responds to Jesus, right? He begs Jesus that he might stay with him, but Jesus actually says to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This is the first missionary, basically. And Jesus says, just go and tell your friends your story. Tell your friends your story about what I've done for you. And he responds faithfully. He responds to the one who has power to restore him faithfully. And as followers of Jesus today, do we have a story to tell? There's one thing to invite people to our religion or our organization, but do we have a story to tell? Do we have a story to tell people about how much the Lord has done for each and every one of us and how he has had mercy upon us? How would we tell that story to our friends? Sometimes it's easier to tell that story to a complete stranger, but how would we tell it to our friends? Our story. What Jesus has done for us. Well, that brings us to the second half of the book, and we're just going to read it straight through. Verses 21 through 43. And this is what we've mentioned before about Mark. He includes in his teachings at different time or in his book what's called an inclusio, or we call it a Mark sandwich, right? Where he starts off with a story and then he kind of pauses telling that one and he tells another one in between and he finishes up with the original story. And this happens quite a few times in the Gospel of Mark, and here is one of them. Now, one of my favorite, I love watching movies about Jesus. And one of my favorite adaptations was the claymation movie a number of years ago called The Miracle Maker. And if you ever get a chance to watch that, maybe it won't be that. It really moved me anyways. It was a great way to tell the story of Jesus. And besides Jesus, the main character is Jairus' daughter. And it's a fascinating way to tell it. Like, she's the main character of the story. And if you have daughters, and you had daughters who are about 12 years old, you know what a joy they bring to your heart. And I'm not cutting down sons, because I was a son. I hope that sons bring joy too. But there's something about daughters, and they need their dads, right? And dads want to sometimes be tough, but dads need their daughters as well. And there's just that special bond, right? And so your daughter is growing out of childhood and becoming a teenager, and you just marvel at them. And this 12-year-old girl has so much ahead of her. And that's where we find ourselves in the story this evening, beginning in verse 21. And when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." You notice that Jesus calls her daughter. And just remember that Jesus calls her daughter. And while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Don't be afraid. Only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion and people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I've been saying over and over again that Mark's favorite word is immediately. And we see it repeated here over and over again. Immediately, immediately, immediately. And so we've got this twin story. And you got Jairus at the beginning, you got the interrupted story, and then you got Jairus at the end, but the stories are so close, aren't they? Jairus is the outside part of the story, and the woman is the inside part of the story. Jairus has a 12-year-old daughter, and the woman has been afflicted for 12 years. Both stories are about fear and faith. It kind of goes with chapter 4, and it kind of goes with chapter 6, the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 6, but these stories are so intertwined, and it goes with the story of the demon-possessed man as well. Jairus, we find out, is one of the rulers of the synagogue. These towns were not that big in Jesus' day, and there might have been 2 or 3 rulers of the synagogue. He's one of them. And word about Jesus has gone out because the woman heard the reports. And the way Jairus reacted, Jairus exactly knew what Jesus was reported to be able to do. Under normal circumstances, Jairus, as a ruler of the synagogue, might have actually not welcomed a visit by Jesus, maybe. Knowing the Pharisees, knowing the leaders of Jerusalem had Jesus on their watch, knowing they were collaborating with the Herodians, knowing they were looking for any reason to get at Jesus, maybe he could have done all right without Jesus. Maybe life would have been okay without Jesus. But when disaster strikes, when your heart is broken, when you are hopeless, when you have no one who can help, all of a sudden, social standing, social reproach, what other people might do or say against you doesn't really matter if your daughter is dying. Have you ever thought about that? You listening in are probably a normal law-abiding citizen and would never do anything to warrant going to prison or being executed of a crime. Let's just say going to prison. But what if the only way to save your dying child was to do something that you knew was morally right, but other people with power would be able to accuse you of doing something wrong? What would you do? Disaster has struck Jairus. His daughter is really sick, and she is about to die. And he sees Jesus. And he embarrassingly falls at Jesus' feet. He's humiliating himself. He falls at Jesus' feet. But who cares about social standing? Who cares about political controversy? Who cares about religious controversy if your daughter is dying? And Jairus falls at his feet and he pleads with Jesus. And the interesting thing here is, if what we know about Jesus is true, Jairus is talking to the one individual who loves his daughter more than Jairus does, or Jairus and his wife do. That's hard sometimes for us to put into our minds, right? But when we are concerned about our children or whatever it might be, and we're praying to God, we're praying to someone who cares about our children more than we do. That's actually good news, isn't it? And he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. And listen to Jairus. He says, you can make her well. Doesn't say it in those words, but he says, you lay your hands on her so she may be well again. You can make her well. I believe you can do this. And Jesus goes with them. But then they get interrupted. And here comes this woman. The woman is unclean. The woman is impure because of her affliction. The demon-possessed man was impure. The woman is impure. What happens if you touch an impure person? And she says to herself, if I touch his garments, I will be made well. Jairus says to Jesus, come and lay your hands on her so she may be made well. And she says, if I touch him, I will be made well. You notice what these two individuals have in common. And when she touches him, immediately her affliction is gone. She feels it in her body. What a wonderful moment it was. And Jesus, and this is kind of difficult for us to understand, but he recognizes that power had gone out from him. It's like he didn't even consciously do this. But remember, John said, one is coming. He is coming who is mightier or more powerful than I. Jesus has power. He commands the wind and the waves. He has power. He commands demons. He has power. She touches him and he perceives that power has gone out from him. Who touched my garments? And the disciples think now Jesus is the dense one. Look at all these people. What do you mean who touched you? And the woman comes in fear and trembling, and she falls down before him. Isn't that kind of like Jairus? She falls down before him and she tells him the whole truth. And this curious moment, there's this intimacy to this contact between Jesus and the one who faithfully responds to him. We sing sometimes, oh, he touched me. There is this intimacy in the nature of the contact between Jesus and the one who faithfully seeks or responds to him. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Faith is the channel through which the power of Jesus can work when we trust him. And so then all of a sudden you get to this moment. And Jairus has seen all this. Jairus has seen all this. But his nightmare comes true. And they come to him and they say, your daughter is dead. Don't trouble Jesus anymore. Now, there's a lack of faith here in the sense that Jesus is strong, but he's not strong enough to do anything about this. He could have, but it's too late. But before Jairus can actually respond, and before the news can sink in, Jesus overhears this and says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. Don't be afraid. Just believe. The disciples were afraid on the boat, and they were afraid after the miracle. The townspeople were afraid seeing the demon-possessed man in his right mind and after hearing what had happened. The woman was afraid after Jesus asked, who touched me? Jairus' daughter has been announced dead, and Jesus turns to him and says, don't be afraid. Just believe. And in kind of his custom, he only takes the three with him, Peter, James, and John. And there's this Middle Eastern response to death, the open grieving. And Jesus, kind of similar to what he said to the disciples, why were you afraid? He says to them, why are you making such a commotion? This child is not dead, but she's only sleeping. Now, in Judaism and in early Christianity, sleeping was a synonym for death. What's Jesus saying? They know what he's saying. The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laugh at him, and he bears social reproach. They mock him. They don't believe. Jesus is going to face this over this very issue, over and over again. But he takes the child's father and mother, and Peter, James, and John, and he takes the little girl by the hand and says, Talitha Kumai. Mark doesn't often leave words in the original language, but he does here. There's a couple other places, but he does here. And there's nothing like magical about what Jesus said. It's not a formula. It's what you would say to anybody to wake up from a sleep. Remember when he talked about the farmer and the seed, and he sleeps and he rises. And now you see the little girl is sleeping and going to rise. Talitha Kumai, little girl, I say to you, arise. He who is coming after me, who is mightier than I, John said. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey his voice? I say to you, little girl, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, and they were immediately not overcome with fear, but overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this. Now, there's an interesting thing here. that no one should know this. And we say, well, why is Jesus doing that? But here's something that maybe it's going to be obvious if it's not already obvious. It's being spoken of right now. So Jesus did not mean for it to never be known. Just not at that time. We're reading it. We're talking about it. We're amazed by it, just as Jairus and his wife were amazed by it, just as Peter, James, and John were amazed by it. But it wasn't time for it to be known. But the good news of the Son of God, it's going towards something. And what happened with that little girl is what's going to happen with Jesus when he once and for all defeats death, evil, and sin. And so what happened to Jesus is going to happen to all of Jesus's people. And we hear him say to us what he said to Jairus. Don't be afraid, but believe. Believe in who I am so you can faithfully respond. Don't be afraid, but believe. And when you think about it, it's the most wonderful news in the world one day when Jesus is going to say to all the little girls and all the little boys and all of his people, arise. Arise. And as he said to that elderly woman, daughter, your faith has made you well. He's going to say to all of his sons and daughters, arise, my children. Don't be afraid, but believe. So next week, we're going to look at Mark chapter 6. And again, as I said, they're long chapters. And so it's going to be a challenge. We're not going to be able to read them all, unfortunately. And we can't break it up too much, else we'd be here 40 weeks from now. But anyways, I do want to say some good news. Ruth Sylvester had a grandchild. And she's really looking forward to when the pandemic is over to be able to visit her first grandchild. And so we're certainly thankful for that and thankful for the safe delivery of the child. And we want to remind everyone that if you have any announcements, any prayer requests, please let us know. And we're going to be back next week in Mark chapter 6. I really encourage you to read the chapter because you don't know what sections we are going to cover, but they are any of the Gospels. But the Gospel of Mark is a very simple book to read and very powerful. So please bow with me in a word of closing prayer. Father God, we are so thankful for you. We're thankful you continually watch over us. We're thankful for Jesus. Father, we are so thankful for the power that Jesus has when he says to us that we can trust in him, that he will see us through, that he will conquer everything that opposes us, Father, that he has the ability to do so, Father. Father, please be with all those who struggle. Please be with all those who might be struggling in faith. Help them to find encouragement in your Son. And Father, if there's anything that we could do to offer a word of encouragement to those living around us, that they might look to your Son, please, Father, please help us have the courage and the boldness to do so, Father. Help us to learn to tell our story about what your Son has done for us. It is through Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless everyone.